Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we looked at women's writing. The lectures explored key themes of gender, power, and education through the analysis of Rajsundari Devi's autobiography Amar Jiban and Begum Rokea's short story Sultana's Dream. In Amar Jiban, Rajsundari's secret pursuit of literacy within the domestic sphere is both a subtle act of resistance and a reinforcement of patriarchal ideals as she frames her intellectual desire through religious devotion. Feminist scholars argue that her narrative reveals both individual agency and the limitations imposed by caste and class hierarchies, often excluding lower class, lower caste women. This tension is further illuminated by nationalist ideologies that constructed a binary between the respectable upper caste woman and the morally suspect common woman. Meanwhile, Sultana's Dream presents a radical feminist utopia where women, through education and science, assume power and redefine social norms. The text critiques patriarchal structures, especially the Parda system, by inverting gender roles and offering Ladyland as a dreamscape of equality, efficiency, and harmony. However, Rokea's hierarchical systems under a new guise actually create a new hierarchy which is matriarchal in nature. Both texts illuminate how women's writing in colonial Bengal navigate complex intersections of conformity and resistance, offering critical insight into the construction of gender, the politics of education, and the imaginative possibilities of a feminist future. In this lecture, we will begin with women's activism, specifically women and the Indian National Congress. The late 19th century and the early 20th century in India saw a rise in women's participation in politics through Indian National Congress. Let us begin with a brief history. The Indian National Congress was founded on December 28, 1885 by Alan Octavian Hume and other Indian leaders who played a crucial role in India's struggle for independence and post-independence governance. Initially, it sought constitutional reforms through dialogue with the British, but shifted towards mass movements as nationalism grew. The partition of Bengal in 1905 fueled extremism within the party, leading to split between moderates and extremists in 1907, which was later resolved by the Lucknow Pact of 1916. Under Gandhi's leadership, the Indian National Congress transformed into a mass movement, organizing key protests like the non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, and Quit India movement. Launched in response to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the disillusionment with British promises after the World War I, the non-cooperation movement called for Indians to boycott British institutions, titles, courts, schools, and foreign goods. Gandhi emphasized non-violence and self-reliance, also known as Swadeshi. The movement mobilized millions across India but was abruptly suspended after the violent Chauri Chaura incident in 1922, where protesters killed policemen, violating Gandhi's non-violent principles. Sparked by the Salt March or Dandi March in 1930, the civil disobedience movement protested the British monopoly on salt and other oppressive colonial laws. Indians were urged to defy British rules non-violently by making salt, refusing to pay taxes, boycotting foreign goods, and resigning from government jobs. The movement saw widespread participation, including women and peasants. Though temporarily halted by the Gandhi-Irwin Pact of 1931, it resumed after the failure of the Second Roundtable Conference and continued until 1934. Now launched during the World War II, the Quit India movement was a final, decisive push demanding to end the British rule. On 8 August 1942, the Indian National Congress called for immediate independence with slogan "Do or Die." The British responded with mass arrests, including Gandhi and other top leaders. Despite harsh repression, spontaneous uprisings erupted across the country. Though the movement was suppressed, it marked a turning point by demonstrating that British rule was no longer sustainable without India's cooperation. After the World War II, growing nationalist pressure led to the Mountbatten Plan of 1947, the British proposal that led to the partition of British India into two independent dominions, resulting in India's independence and partition. Post-independence, the Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, focused on economic planning, socialism, and non-alignment. Throughout the history of Indian National Congress, women have played a vital role, contributing significantly to freedom struggle and the country's development after independence. In the early stages, Indian politics was largely a male-dominated space. However, the rise of social reform movements in the 19th century, which focused on women's education, the abolition of harmful social practices like sati and child marriage, and the promotion of women's rights, laid the foundation for women's entry into public and political life. This progressive atmosphere enabled educated women from elite and reformist families to engage in political discussions and activities. One of the earliest women to participate in INC proceedings was Swarna Kumari Devi, sister of Rabindranath Tagore, who was not only a writer and intellectual but also a committed nationalist. A major breakthrough occurred in 1917 when Sarojini Naidu, Annie Besant, and Margaret Cousins formed the Women's Association and demanded voting rights for Indian women. Their efforts marked the formal entry of women into nationalist politics. Sarojini Naidu went on to become the first female president of Indian National Congress in 1925, setting a powerful precedent for women's leadership in the nationalist movement. Under Gandhi's leadership from 1920 to 47, women's political participation witnessed a massive surge. His vision of nationalism and emphasis on non-violent movements encouraged women to step out of their homes and take active roles in public protests. Women played essential roles in key nationalist movements such as the non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement. They led marches, picketed shops selling foreign goods or liquor, spun khadi, and courted arrest. Gandhi believed in women's moral strength and their ability to lead by example, which gave many courage to challenge social norms and claim a political voice. Prominent women leaders emerged during this time. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was the first Indian woman to hold a cabinet post and later become the first female president of United Nations General Assembly. Aruna Asaf Ali famously hoisted the Indian national flag during the Quit India movement. Kasturba Gandhi was actively involved in Sabarmati Ashram and various grassroots campaigns. Kamala Nehru was instrumental in organizing women in the Allahabad region, and Matangini Hazra, who was shot while leading protest in Bengal, symbolized women's fearless dedication to the cause. The political landscape significantly transformed the objectives and roles of organized women. While education, social reform, and women's rights resonated with some progressive women, the broader nationalist movement aimed at freeing the country from foreign rule drew support from diverse social classes, communities, and ideologies. Nationalist leaders strategically built alliances with peasants, workers, and women's organizations to showcase widespread public backing. Many women were surprised to find their political involvement endorsed by men who would otherwise expect them to conform to traditional domestic roles as prescribed in religious texts. Manmohini Zutsi Sahgal, a freedom fighter imprisoned in Lahore in 1930, recounted the story of a woman who participated in protest and was arrested while her husband was at work. Upon hearing that she was arrested, her husband sent a message to the jail saying that she was not welcome back to home after her release. Manmohini's mother, Ladu Rani Zutshi, stepped in to advocate for the woman. The husband eventually took his wife back, though he remarked that while he considered it an honor for her to be arrested, she should have sought his permission before leaving the house. The incident served as a powerful lesson on the challenges faced by women in the freedom movement, where the nation and the home were often contradictory. After independence, women continued to shape the political landscape. The most notable example is Indira Gandhi, who became India's first female Prime Minister in 1966. Her leadership during key moments like the Green Revolution, the Bangladesh Liberation War, and the emergency period highlighted both the power and controversy that could come with strong female leadership. Women's increasing presence in the parliament, cabinet positions, and social reform committees over the years reflects a gradual but meaningful shift from symbolic participation to substantive roles in decision making and governance. This gave rise to different facets in women's participation, which are inclusion of women as token, women as citizens and not necessarily as gendered citizens, and women aspiring to be political leaders. Now, let us summarize today's lecture. This lecture explores the significant role women played in the Indian National Congress and the broader Indian independence movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The National Congress, founded in 1885, initially focused on constitutional reforms with the British, but soon shifted to mass movement. With the rise of INC and its evolving strategies, women became increasingly involved in the political process. Key themes of these movements involved evolution of women's participation in politics, their contribution to major nationalist movements, and the impact of these movements on their political and social roles. Initially, politics in India was dominated by men, but the social reform movement of the 19th century, which focused on women's rights, created a foundation for women's political engagement. One of the earliest women to engage with INC was Swarna Kumari Devi, and in 1917, Sarojini Naidu, Annie Besant, and Margaret Cousins formed the Women's Indian Association and demanded voting rights for women. However, women's political participation was not without challenge. Despite the push for women's rights and education, traditional gender norms often placed limitation on their involvement in politics. The nationalist movement, while drew support from diverse social classes, many of these women were expected to adhere to gender roles. One such example is given by Manmohini Zootsi Sehgal, who talks about a woman who was arrested during her protest and was not accepted by the husband upon her release. This incident illustrates the tension between women's growing political participation and their domestic roles. The lecture highlighted two key factors of women's participation in politics: the inclusion of women as citizens and not necessarily as gendered citizens. In other words, these movements actually focused on the growing number of people as the mass movement which was opposing the British colonizers. But the specificity of gender or the difference between men and women was never recognized. Secondly, this period also saw the aspiration of women to become political leaders. It shows how women, despite social constraints, often became powerful agents in fight for independence and in shaping post-independent political landscape. In the next lectures, we will talk more about women's movements and writings. Thank you.